Passava imediatamente a palavra à doutora Teodora Cardoso. Eu perguntava-lhe de alguma forma, se calhar, nesta ideia de que Mark Blyth pede emprestada a Keynes, de que é na expansão e não na recessão que se aplica a austeridade.
Muito obrigada. Bom dia a todos.
Professor, se conseguirmos fazer uma coisa, o professor pode ficar a pedir.
Okay, I'm asked to speak English. I had not been asked before, so sorry. I shall try. Your question is a very good one, because I do think that it is in the booms and not the slumps that you have to prepare for the slumps, which is in fact the case. We need to create what is usually mentioned nowadays as fiscal space. Fiscal space is exactly the space, the room for maneuver, if you want, for fiscal policy to be able, in the slumps, to put in place expansionary policies that can fight the slump. If you do not have that fiscal space, then you enter into debt again, and into deficits and the need to finance debt. There is a big difference, a huge difference between Portugal and, in fact, any other country and the United States. The United States has what Barry Ashengreen used as a title for one of his books, the exorbitant privilege of issuing the international currency. So the American debt is nominated in dollars and is paid in dollars, and the United States issue dollars. This doesn't help to anybody else, and it happens even less in the case of Eurozone countries that do not even issue euros. So a small economy in the Eurozone has to be very careful about obtaining this fiscal space if it wants to be able to finance the way out of slumps without too much austerity. But there is a second problem in the case of the Portuguese economy that also requires fiscal space, and that is the financing of social policies. I must say that this is a personal option, but I am in favor of a strong social policies in a country, and in particular in Portugal. I think they can be sustained, but we need to have fiscal space to sustain them. And this is because expenditures, and in particular expenditures in things like health and pensions, have a dynamic of themselves. And a dynamic that, together with other more short-term expenditures, like, for example, unemployment benefits, the so-called automatic stabilizer policies. These expenditures tend to increase during slumps. In the case of pensions and health, they increase not just in slumps, but they increase on account of demographic and even technological factors. And they increase in the long term. They don't just increase in the short term. So if we want to have the capacity to deal with these short-term effects of automatic stabilizers and also finance strong social policies, we need a very careful long-term planning of expenditures. We cannot trust just the increase of taxes to cover everything in terms of social policies, because taxes also have their own limits, and we have been observing them in Portugal lately. So we need to create this fiscal space and plan these expenditures very carefully. So this brings us back to the Keynes sentence or phrase that you need to create this space during the booms and not if you want to deal with the slumps effectively. There are cases in the European Union that prove that this is possible. And for example, Mark Blyth said that in Sweden nothing happened. Well, in Sweden a lot happened, not just in Sweden, but in the Nordic countries in general, but particularly in Sweden, when they had their crisis at the beginning of the 90s. They changed the fiscal framework of the country in order to take into account the problem of the fiscal space, and in order to take into account another thing that is essential for a small open economy, which is competitiveness. These countries have very high wages, have very strong trade unions, have a very high level of expenditure in pensions and in health, and they created the fiscal space that led them, for example, Sweden, to enter the 2007 crisis with a debt ratio of around 35% of GDP. So, and with a very stable and efficient banking system that had been dealt with, again, during the crisis in the 90s. So these countries were able to go through the recession, the international recession, without feeling practically any effect from that slump. Unemployment didn't rise substantially, the economies are growing, and the budgets are in balance. So this is possible. And this is very much a problem of the country itself, but it is not a problem of austerity. It's not just creating measures of cutting everything or liquidating everything in the expression of Andrew Mellon. That is not what is at stake. What is at stake is that when the crisis erupts, and this crisis erupts normally from the outside, and in this case, very particularly, this crisis originated in the United States. When they erupt, the countries have to deal with them, and if they don't have fiscal space, they are obliged to have austerity because they are cut off from financing. That was our case. If the vulnerability is very high, and if in the period before the crisis we did not create the necessary fiscal space, we lose access to financing. And in that case, we have to take emergency measures. But those emergency measures should be accompanied by measures in the change of the fiscal framework, in some cases of the political framework itself, in order to create the conditions for a rapid liberation, let's say, from the austerity measures. What is the problem in Portugal, in my opinion, is that we were stuck with the austerity measures and we did not enough in the structural side and in the institutional side. The fiscal framework, for example, has not changed, And as I said, the fiscal framework has to take into account mainly the medium to long-term planning of expenditures and not the year-to-year planning. We are still stuck with yearly budgets, annual budgets, and that is not enough by any means. And until we make those changes, and in several other areas of the economy itself, until we make those changes, we won't get the credibility to be able to get the financing that we need to get the economy growing again. This is not, in the case of Portugal, essentially a problem of the banks. The banks were, in our case, the banks were suffered the effects of the sovereign crisis. The Portuguese banks were not financing Portuguese debt when the crisis erupted. The Portuguese debt was all financed by foreigners, and this is a very specific problem. When you can finance the debt internally, you have more room for maneuver. When the debt is financed externally, and when together with public debt you have a huge private debt, all financed abroad, this makes for a very large vulnerability, which was the cause for our problem. So we have, our banks were attained by this. They had to deleverage, and this, of course, affected the economy. But the economy itself was already affected in terms of demand for credit because both households and firms were so highly indebted that whatever the banks could provide in terms of financing, there was no demand for that. So the deleveraging came from both sides in our case, and they came from an economy that had been booming on a basis that was not sustainable. And that is what needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.